On a freezing December night in 2018, in a forgotten corner of the Ozark Mountains, a woman stumbled into a rural emergency room clutching her swollen belly, her face pale as death, whispering words that would haunt the medical staff forever. "This baby cannot be born. This baby should not exist." But I had no choice. When the doctors delivered that child 3 hours later, they had no idea they were bringing into the world a living impossibility. A child whose DNA would reveal a family secret so twisted, so carefully orchestrated across 6 generations, that it would challenge everything we understand about human nature, survival, and the depths of obsession that can consume an entire bloodline. The genetic testing that followed didn't just uncover incest or abuse, it exposed something far more sinister. A deliberate, methodical breeding program that had been operating in complete secrecy since the 1860s, turning human beings into specimens in an experiment that nobody consented to. An experiment that created biological relationships so tangled that modern science had to invent new terminology just to describe them. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of true crime, to stories about family secrets that defy belief, and mysteries that reveal the terrifying things humans are capable of when they isolate themselves from the world, then you need to subscribe right now and turn on those notifications, because we bring you the most disturbing, most unbelievable, true stories that will change how you see the world. Hit that like button if you're ready to have your mind absolutely shattered by what you're about to hear. And drop a comment telling me if you think you could handle discovering something like this about your own family. Now let's dive into a story so dark, so complex, that it took investigators 3 years just to map out the full horror of what had been happening. The woman who stumbled into that emergency room was named Anna Brennan, and she was 26 years old, though she looked at least a decade older, her face carved with lines of stress and fear that no young woman should carry. She had driven for nearly 4 hours from a place called Whispering Pines, a settlement so remote that it doesn't appear on Google Maps, a collection of about 40 buildings scattered across a valley where cell phone signals don't reach, and where the nearest neighbor might be miles away. Anna had lived her entire life in Whispering Pines, and until that December night, she had never been more than 20 miles from the place she was born. Dr. Sarah Chen was the emergency room physician who first examined Anna, and she immediately knew something was very wrong beyond just the obvious medical emergency of a woman in premature labor. Anna's vital signs were unstable. She was severely malnourished despite being in her 3rd trimester, and she had bruises in various stages of healing covering her arms and legs. But it was Anna's psychological state that disturbed Dr. Chen the most. Anna kept repeating that same phrase over and over, "This baby should not exist." When Dr. Chen tried to comfort her, tried to tell her that every baby deserves to be born, Anna grabbed the doctor's arm with surprising strength and said something that made Dr. Chen's blood run cold. "You don't understand. This baby's family tree doesn't branch. It's a circle. It goes around, and it should have been broken decades ago, but they wouldn't let it break." Anna went into full labor before Dr. Chen could get more information, and the delivery was complicated. Emergency C-section. The baby's heartbeat dropping dangerously low. The operating room filled with that controlled chaos that doctors train for but hope never to experience. When they finally pulled the baby out, a tiny girl weighing barely 4 pounds, the infant let out a weak cry that the surgical team would later describe as the saddest sound they had ever heard, as if the baby somehow knew she had been born into circumstances that no child should face. The baby girl survived, transferred immediately to the NICU, and it was during those first critical hours that Anna, heavily medicated but conscious, began to tell Dr. Chen her story. Dr. Chen recorded the conversation, and that recording would become the foundation of an investigation that would eventually involve the FBI, genetic researchers from 3 universities, and historians who specialized in isolated American communities. What Anna revealed was so disturbing that Dr. Chen initially thought she might be experiencing some kind of psychotic break induced by the trauma of childbirth. Anna explained that Whispering Pines was not just a remote community. It was a sanctuary, that's what they called it, founded in 1862 by a man named Tobias Brennan, who had deserted from the Confederate Army. Tobias had fled deep into the Ozarks with his wife, his 3 brothers, and their families, about 20 people total, seeking to escape not just the war, but what Tobias called the corruption of the modern world. Tobias was a religious extremist, but his religion was something he had created himself, a twisted mixture of Old Testament literalism, apocalyptic prophecy, and an obsession with something he called bloodline purity. Tobias believed that his family had been chosen by God for a special purpose, that they carried a divine spark in their blood that would eventually produce a prophet who would lead humanity into a new age. But this divine spark, Tobias preached, could only be preserved through what he called sacred union, which was his euphemistic term for systematic inbreeding. Tobias had studied the royal families of Europe, how they had married cousins to keep power concentrated, and he had decided to apply the same principle, but for spiritual rather than political reasons. His family, he declared, would not marry outsiders. They would preserve the bloodline generation after generation until the prophet was finally born. The first generation of Whispering Pines followed Tobias's commands without question, though they had little choice being so isolated and so completely under his psychological control. Tobias arranged marriages between his own children, between his nephews and nieces, creating unions that violated both state law and moral norms, but which Tobias justified with his religious teachings. He kept meticulous records, journals that documented every birth, every marriage, every death, and he recorded what he believed were signs of the divine spark emerging in certain children: unusual eye color, birthmarks in specific patterns, dreams and visions that he interpreted as prophetic. What Tobias didn't understand, what the science of his era couldn't tell him, was that he was creating a genetic bottleneck that would have devastating consequences for his descendants. The first few generations saw increasing rates of infant mortality, birth defects, and cognitive disabilities, but Tobias interpreted these tragedies not as evidence that his system was flawed, but as tests of faith, as sacrifices necessary to achieve the ultimate goal of producing the prophet. Tobias died in 1889, but his ideology didn't die with him. His oldest son, Jeremiah Brennan, took control of Whispering Pines and continued his father's program with even greater fervor. Jeremiah expanded Tobias's journals into what he called the Book of Lines, a comprehensive genealogical record that tracked every member of the community and specified which bloodlines should be joined in each generation to maximize what Jeremiah believed was the concentration of the divine spark. The Book of Lines became the most sacred object in Whispering Pines, more important than the Bible, consulted for every major decision the community made. By the 3rd generation, Whispering Pines had developed elaborate systems to hide their practices from the outside world. They had learned to forge documents, to bribe local officials who might ask questions, to present a facade of normalcy on the rare occasions when outsiders came near. They claimed to be a simple farming community, deeply religious but harmless, and the outside world left them alone because Whispering Pines was so remote, so seemingly insignificant, that no one bothered to look closely at what was really happening there. Anna explained to Dr. Chen that she was part of the 6th generation of Whispering Pines, and that the Book of Lines had dictated every major event of her life. She had been told from early childhood that she was special, that she carried an unusually strong concentration of the divine spark, and that her destiny was to produce the prophet that Tobias had foretold over 150 years earlier. She had been raised in complete isolation, educated only in the community's religious teachings, taught to believe that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, that only within Whispering Pines could she find safety and purpose. When Anna turned 16, the community elders, a council of 5 men who controlled every aspect of life in Whispering Pines, consulted the Book of Lines and announced her match. This is where Anna's voice on the recording breaks, where you can hear her struggling to say the words, where the full horror of her situation becomes clear. The Book of Lines specified that Anna should bear children with her own father, Thomas Brennan, because according to the genealogical calculations recorded in the book, this particular pairing would create the highest concentration of the divine spark yet achieved. Anna refused, the first person in her generation to refuse a match ordained by the Book of Lines, and her refusal created a crisis in Whispering Pines. The elders were stunned because refusal wasn't something they had prepared for. Their system had worked for so long, breaking people down psychologically until they accepted their assigned roles, that they didn't have protocols for dealing with someone who said no and meant it. Anna was locked in what they called the meditation house, essentially a windowless shed, given minimal food and water, and subjected to constant visits from elders who told her she was endangering not just her own soul, but the souls of everyone in Whispering Pines, that she was preventing the fulfillment of a divine prophecy that had been building for 6 generations. Anna held out for 3 weeks, and then something happened that she describes on the recording as the worst day of her life. The elders brought her mother to the meditation house, and her mother begged her to accept the match. Her mother explained that she too had been matched with her own father when she was 16, that she too had resisted at first, but that she had eventually accepted it as God's will. Anna's mother told her that if Anna continued to refuse, the elders would select Anna's younger sister for the match instead, and her sister was only 14 years old. Anna agreed to the match to protect her sister, but she made a secret vow that she would find a way to escape, to break the cycle that had trapped her family for 6 generations. The problem was that escape from Whispering Pines was nearly impossible. The community was geographically isolated, accessible only by a single narrow road that was watched constantly. No one had personal vehicles. All transportation was controlled by the elders. There was no internet access, no phones, no way to contact the outside world. The few community members who had tried to escape in previous generations had been caught and brought back. And after that, they were never quite the same, broken by psychological punishment that Anna describes as worse than physical torture. Anna became pregnant at 17, a pregnancy that the Book of Lines proclaimed as potentially the most significant in the community's history. She was monitored constantly, her diet controlled, her activities restricted, treated not as a person but as a vessel carrying something precious. She gave birth to a son who appeared healthy, and the elders examined the baby extensively, looking for signs of the divine spark, for indications that this child might be the prophet. When the baby showed no unusual characteristics, the elders were disappointed, but not discouraged. The Book of Lines specified that Anna should have multiple children, that the prophet might be the 2nd or 3rd or 4th child. Over the next 8 years, Anna had 3 more children, each one taking a piece of her soul, each birth reminding her that she was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. Her children were raised communally, taught the same ideology that had imprisoned her, and Anna watched in horror as her oldest son began to show signs of accepting the community's teachings, began to talk about his destiny, about how one day he might be chosen for an important match by the Book of Lines. The genetic consequences of 6 generations of systematic inbreeding were becoming impossible to ignore. Of Anna's 4 children, one had been born with a severe heart defect and died before his first birthday. Another had significant cognitive disabilities and would never be able to live independently. The community's infant mortality rate had climbed to nearly 40%, and there were several adults in Whispering Pines who required constant care due to genetic disorders. But the elders interpreted these problems the same way Tobias had over a century earlier, as tests of faith, as the price that had to be paid for maintaining bloodline purity. Anna's breaking point came when the elders announced that her oldest daughter, who had just turned 13, had been consulted in the Book of Lines and had been matched. The match specified in the book was with one of the elders themselves, a man who was 63 years old and who was, through the tangled web of relationships in Whispering Pines, simultaneously the girl's great-uncle, her cousin, and her genetic half-brother through multiple complicated lineages. Anna realized that if she didn't act immediately, her daughter would be subjected to the same abuse that Anna had endured, and the cycle would continue into a 7th generation. Anna began to plan her escape with a desperation born of knowing she had only one chance. She started hoarding small amounts of food, hiding them in places where the elders wouldn't look. She began to fake illness, complaining of headaches and dizziness, establishing a pattern of health problems that would make it less suspicious when she eventually claimed she needed medical attention from outside the community. She memorized the guard rotation at the community's entrance, noting the times when surveillance was least intense. And most importantly, she discovered that she was pregnant again, her 5th pregnancy, and she made the decision that this child would not be born in Whispering Pines. The pregnancy was risky given Anna's history and her poor health from years of malnutrition and stress, and she was able to convince the elders that she needed specialized prenatal care that wasn't available in the community. This was a delicate negotiation because the elders were extremely reluctant to let anyone leave Whispering Pines, even temporarily. But Anna had one advantage. The elders believed this pregnancy might finally produce the prophet, and they didn't want to risk losing the baby due to inadequate medical care. They agreed to let Anna leave for medical appointments, but only under strict supervision. She would be driven by one of the elders to a clinic in a small town about an hour away. She would be watched during the entire appointment, and she would be driven immediately back to Whispering Pines. Anna went to 3 appointments under these conditions, each time noting details about the route, about the timing, about the procedures, planning for her eventual escape. On what was supposed to be her 4th appointment, Anna made her move. The elder driving her, a man named Samuel, who was actually Anna's uncle and her cousin, simultaneously through the community's tangled genetics, stopped at a gas station about 30 minutes from Whispering Pines. This was the moment Anna had been waiting for. When Samuel went inside to pay, Anna, 8 months pregnant and weak from malnutrition, somehow found the strength to slide into the driver's seat and drive away. She knew she had maybe a 10-minute head start before Samuel could call other community members, and they began pursuing her. She drove as fast as she dared on the winding mountain roads, her pregnant belly pressed against the steering wheel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely maintain control of the vehicle. She passed the turnoff to the clinic where she was supposed to have her appointment, continuing instead toward the nearest city, toward freedom, toward a world she had been taught all her life was dangerous, but which couldn't possibly be worse than what she was fleeing. Anna drove for 4 hours, until the labor pains became so intense she could no longer safely operate the vehicle. She pulled into the emergency room where Dr. Chen found her, and she had made it just in time. If she had waited even another hour, both she and her baby would likely have died, not from the labor itself, but from complications that had been building throughout the pregnancy. Complications that would have been detected if Anna had been receiving proper prenatal care. Dr. Chen listened to all of this over the course of several hours, as Anna was recovering from the emergency C-section, as her premature baby daughter fought for life in the NICU. Dr. Chen documented everything, and then she did what Anna begged her to do. She called the FBI. Because what Anna was describing wasn't just a case of domestic abuse or even systematic child abuse. It was potentially a case of organized criminal conspiracy spanning multiple generations, involving child marriage, systematic rape under the guise of religious practice, document fraud, and possibly even human trafficking, given that community members were prevented from leaving. The FBI investigation that followed was one of the most complex in the agency's history. They couldn't just raid Whispering Pines because the community was technically on private property, and the legal justification for a raid was complicated given that many of the community members would claim they were there voluntarily. Instead, they built their case carefully, gathering evidence, interviewing Anna extensively, and researching the history of the Brennan family and Whispering Pines. The breakthrough came when investigators found historical records showing that several missing persons reports had been filed over the years by family members of people who had joined Whispering Pines and then cut off all contact with the outside world. These cases had never been seriously investigated because the adults in question had voluntarily joined the community, and there was no evidence of foul play. But when investigators looked more closely, they found patterns that suggested Whispering Pines had been actively recruiting vulnerable people, particularly young women, bringing them into the community and then preventing them from leaving. 6 months after Anna's escape, the FBI finally had enough evidence to move in. They coordinated with state police and child protective services, and on a warm June morning, they entered Whispering Pines with warrants for multiple arrests and court orders to remove children from dangerous situations. What they found shocked even the experienced investigators who thought they had seen everything. Whispering Pines was like stepping back in time. The buildings were primitive, most without electricity or running water. The community's 40 residents looked malnourished and showed signs of poor medical care. Several children had obvious untreated medical conditions. And most disturbing of all, the investigators found the Book of Lines, the document that had controlled this community for 6 generations, a massive leather-bound journal filled with genealogical charts so complicated that they looked like something from a horror movie, lines connecting names in patterns that made no sense until you realized you were looking at systematic inbreeding documented across 150 years. The genetic testing that followed was conducted by Dr. Michael Torres, a geneticist from Stanford University who specialized in isolated populations. What Dr. Torres found in the DNA of Whispering Pines residents was unprecedented in modern genetic research. The community had an average coefficient of inbreeding of 0.45, a number so high that Dr. Torres initially thought there must be an error in his calculations. To put that in perspective, normal human populations have coefficients close to 0. Deliberately inbred laboratory mice might have coefficients around 0.25, and anything above 0.30 in humans is considered extreme inbreeding that would typically result in non-viable offspring. But the Whispering Pines community had been managing this extreme inbreeding for 6 generations through a combination of factors that Dr. Torres described as darkly fascinating from a scientific perspective. They had, whether intentionally or through trial and error, developed practices that maximize the survival of offspring in a highly inbred population. They practiced intensive prenatal selection, monitoring pregnancies closely, and having a surprisingly high rate of miscarriages and stillbirths that they didn't talk about. essentially allowing nature to select against the most genetically compromised fetuses. They had developed folk medical knowledge about which herbal remedies could help with certain genetic conditions. And perhaps most disturbingly, they had normalized infant mortality to such an extent that losing a baby was considered almost routine. Not a tragedy, but an expected part of maintaining the bloodline. Dr. Torres's analysis of the Book of Lines revealed that whoever had been maintaining that document across the generations had been following principles that were surprisingly sophisticated from a breeding perspective, even though they were based on religious ideology rather than scientific understanding. The book specified matches that avoided the most genetically dangerous pairings while still maintaining extreme inbreeding, and it incorporated a kind of line breeding strategy that animal breeders use, where specific desirable individuals have their genetic contribution maximized across multiple generations. The horrifying implication was that over 6 generations, Whispering Pines had essentially created a human breeding experiment, not with the controlled conditions and ethical oversight that would be required for legitimate genetic research, but through religious fanaticism and complete disregard for the suffering of individuals. The people of Whispering Pines had become, in genetic terms, almost a separate population from the rest of humanity, carrying DNA markers and genetic combinations that existed nowhere else. Anna's baby daughter, the child whose birth had exposed this entire nightmare, was subjected to extensive genetic testing. The results showed that she was one of the most inbred individuals Dr. Torres had ever documented, with genetic markers indicating that her parents were themselves the product of multiple generations of inbreeding. The baby had inherited identical copies of large sections of her genome, meaning she had double copies of both beneficial and harmful recessive genes. Miraculously, she had not inherited 2 copies of any immediately lethal genetic conditions, but she faced a lifetime of increased health risks. The legal aftermath of the Whispering Pines case was complicated and is still ongoing as of the recording of this story. 11 adults were charged with various crimes including child abuse, conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The elders who had maintained the Book of Lines and enforced the community's rules faced the most serious charges. But proving their crimes was difficult because much of what they had done, while morally reprehensible, occupied gray areas in the law. Arranging marriages between adult family members, for example, is not always clearly illegal depending on the state and the specific relationships involved. The children and teenagers of Whispering Pines, 22 of them total, were removed from the community and placed in foster care, or with distant relatives who had left the community in previous generations. The psychological deprogramming these children required was extensive. They had been raised to believe that the outside world was evil, that their suffering was divinely ordained, that questioning the community's teachings was a sin worthy of eternal damnation. Many of them struggled with the transition, and some of the older teenagers requested to be returned to Whispering Pines. So complete was their psychological conditioning. Anna was granted full custody of her 4 surviving children, though the reunification process was gradual and supervised because Anna herself needed extensive therapy to recover from her trauma. She also kept custody of her baby daughter, the child whose birth had finally broken 6 generations of abuse. Anna changed her name and her children's names, moved to a state far from the Ozarks, and has refused all media requests for interviews. The last update from her social worker indicated that she was working as a seamstress, living in a small apartment, doing everything possible to give her children a normal life despite the extraordinary trauma they had all experienced. The Whispering Pines settlement itself sits abandoned now. The buildings are slowly deteriorating, and the land has been tied up in legal proceedings as authorities try to determine what should be done with property that was the site of multi-generational abuse. The Book of Lines was seized as evidence and is now stored in a FBI facility, a document so disturbing that the handful of people who have read it in full describe it as one of the most evil artifacts they have ever encountered, not because of any single entry, but because of what it represents. The systematic reduction of human beings today, he points in a breeding program, generations of lives planned out before birth based on nothing but the twisted religious vision of one man who died over a century ago. Dr. Torres continues to study the genetic data from Whispering Pines, and his research has contributed to our understanding of how isolated populations develop and how inbreeding affects human genetics. He has published several papers on the subject, always with anonymized data, and he argues that despite the horrifying circumstances, the Whispering Pines case provides valuable scientific insights that could help with genetic counseling and understanding hereditary diseases. Some ethicists have criticized this research, arguing that studying data obtained through abuse is itself unethical, and that debate continues in academic circles. The children of Whispering Pines, now scattered across the country, form a kind of tragic diaspora. Most of them are in therapy, working through the psychological damage of their upbringing. Some have formed support groups, connecting with each other online, helping each other navigate a world they were taught to fear. A few have spoken anonymously about their experiences, describing what it was like to grow up being told you were part of a divine plan, when really you were just a victim of a system that treated human beings as breeding stock. Anna's daughter, the baby that should never have existed, is now 4 years old. According to reports from social workers, she is meeting her developmental milestones, showing no signs of the severe genetic disorders that her DNA profile suggested were possible. She attends preschool, plays with other children, and has no memory of Whispering Pines or the circumstances of her birth. Anna has made the decision not to tell her daughter about her origins until she is much older, wanting to give her as many years of innocence as possible before she has to carry the weight of knowing the truth about where she came from. The question that haunts everyone involved in this case is how something like this could happen in modern America. How a community could systematically abuse children for 6 generations without anyone noticing or intervening. The answer is uncomfortable. Isolation, both geographic and psychological, can hide almost anything. Whispering Pines succeeded for so long because it was remote, because it presented a facade of harmless religious eccentricity, because the people trapped inside were so thoroughly conditioned that they didn't seek help, and because the few who did try to escape were dismissed as troubled individuals rather than credible whistleblowers. There are likely other Whispering Pines out there, other isolated communities hiding dark secrets behind walls of religious ideology and geographic isolation. The FBI has indicated that the Whispering Pines case has led them to investigate several similar communities, though they decline to provide details about ongoing investigations. Child protection advocates argue that this case shows the need for better monitoring of isolated homeschooling communities, for mandatory wellness checks on children even in remote areas, for systems that can detect patterns of systematic abuse before they continue for generations. The Book of Lines remains the most chilling artifact of this entire case, a document that turned human lives into bloodlines on a chart, that reduced love and family to calculated genetic combinations, that justified unthinkable abuse in the name of divine purpose. Historians who have studied it say that it represents a dark tendency in human nature, the ability to systematize and normalize anything, no matter how cruel, if it is given enough religious or ideological justification, and if it continues long enough to become tradition. Anna's act of courage, driving away from that gas station while 8 months pregnant, not knowing if she would make it to safety or if community members would catch her and drag her back. That moment of desperate bravery broke a chain that had held her family prisoner since the Civil War era. 6 generations of abuse ended because one woman decided that her daughter would not suffer what she had suffered, that the cycle had to stop no matter what the cost. Anna saved not just herself, but potentially dozens of future generations who will now be born free from the Book of Lines, free to choose their own partners, free to live lives that are not predetermined by a document written by people who died decades before they were born.